Hello.
All right. Yeah. Hello, Muppet haters. Thank you for joining us when you had an opportunity to get your picture taken with Cookie Monster. Had no idea that's what we would be up against when we had this time slot, but we're happy that you all are here. I'm Cindy Royal, and I teach at Texas State University. I've taught digital concepts, web design, moving into programming for a number of years, and working on some different aspects of putting programming skills into our curriculum. I just spent the last year at Stanford, and I've got a lot of inspiration at Stanford in terms of putting these new skills in our curriculum. Lots of methodologies, lots of buzzwords at Stanford that I learned, one of which is the subject that we're going to be talking about, Agile Ed, and that's the hashtag, and it's on every slide if you forget that that's what it is. And I am joined by Brian Boyer from NPR. He runs the NPR Visuals group. And just to give you a little background on the evolution of this panel, it was originally proposed by Jeremy Rue from Berkeley. So if Jeremy's watching the stream, hello. Thank you for giving me this panel. He couldn't do it. He had to drop out like a month ago. And then they asked me to be on this panel, and through a series of things like people having babies and other events that have occurred, I ended up being the last one left on this panel, and Brian kindly on Monday agreed to join me. So in the spirit of Agile panel presentations, we are going to be practicing some of the techniques that we'll be talking about today. So here's my information. This actual presentation that I'm doing is on SlideShare. So Cindy Royal, didn't finish that on there, slideshare.net/Cindy Royal. And you can get in touch with me in these other spaces. So I'm going to go through some basic definitions of Agile and talk about some of the examples where I have used it even when I didn't even know that I was using it. And then I'll turn it over to Brian to give some of his experience with using it in actual professional settings. So how many of you have actually used Agile methodologies in any way, shape, or form? Okay, so so there's some people who know what it is and some people who probably have no idea what it is. So that's what I'm here to do, is to tell you, for the people who don't have any idea what it is, to get you kind of up to speed with that. Because that's where I was just a few months ago. I haven't had a lot of experience with Agile, but it's something that I'm just now starting to integrate into classes. And so you're just a few weeks behind me. And it's easy to find resources, to think about the different techniques associated with this, and then think about how it might be used in your class. And you might be like me, where you're like, oh yeah, I'm already doing that, I just didn't call it Agile. So in the dictionary, Agile is defined as able to move quickly and easily, very cat-like moves. We don't normally think about that when we think about project management and people working on computers and sitting around a table. But this is actually in the dictionary as the second definition, a method of project management characterized by the division of tasks into short phases of work and frequent reassessment and adaptation of plans. Not as exciting as a jumping cat, but something that is more beneficial in terms of the way we develop things and being able to deliver things more frequently and more cost effectively. So there's a manifesto. If there's a manifesto for something, it's either very exciting or very scary. I'm hoping that this is an exciting aspect of having a manifesto. And the things that are in bold on the left are the parts of the manifesto that are prioritized over the things on the right. It doesn't mean that the things on the right aren't important, it's just that the things on the left take a higher priority. So it's a software methodology approach, working through these values of individuals and interactions have processes, individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. And you can find this online, the Agile Manifesto. So this is in comparison to how software was developed in the past using what's called the Waterfall Development. And basically you had to complete one phase before the next. Some of the phases have similar names. It's just really the approach to it. And when you start a project in that planning phase, it's very difficult to decide what the rest of the steps will be, because that's the point of the project where you know the least. And so you need to be able to have a chance to revisit this and revise it and assess it and then start again or tweak it or move on. And so the waterfall method was not necessarily the most effective way to do this because there was no plan to revisit any of these phases. You just sort of go one by one down the waterfall. So why should we use Agile? Development is expensive and time-consuming. How many of you do software development? Okay, so a few of you have done it, so you can relate. It can be expensive and time-consuming. Building software is more like an art, so it requires creativity. It's not something that there's a step-by-step recipe to do. You have to be very creative when you work on software, and so it requires adjustments and attention to needs and being able to respond to them quickly. Teams need to be empowered, and you need to collaborate when you're making software. Sometimes we think of it as an individual activity, but really, to do a large-scale project, and I'm sure Brian will talk about his team, you have to be able to collaborate, and so the Agile methodology provides guidance for how teams should work and integrate. Development often requires customers to be involved in the process. That's pretty important to be able to get your customers' needs reflected in the software you develop. And there are changing requirements often throughout the life cycle of a project. And this is what I know from doing web design. A website is never complete, right? I mean, it goes on forever. You're never completely done with it. So that's another aspect that the waterfall method doesn't take into consideration. You sort of get to the end of the process and you assume that things are over, but things are never over. And so Agile methodologies help create a more appropriate environment for doing this kind of work. And there are a lot of phrases associated with Agile, things like speed, rapid, adaptability, focused on quality, cooperation, iterative. The thing that got me really like, I get it now, is this line here that says, it's not a process, it's a philosophy or a set of values for doing development. And when you look at it that way, you can see that this is not just a software development philosophy, but it's really a project management philosophy that you can use in a lot of different settings. And when I first presented it to students this semester, that was their take. They very quickly and astutely said, oh, well, this isn't just for software development. This seems like this is how things happen in the real world. You have to respond to changes, you have to be quick, you have to collaborate. So it is reflected by small teams, spending short time frames, building small things, and then those small things kind of add up. Integrating regularly, and there are different approaches to Agile, and we'll talk mostly about the Scrum approach, but you may hear about other tools and techniques and approaches associated with this general principle. So there are 12 principles of Agile. You'll go online and you can download these principles and find them, but it has a lot to do with the different phrases that I just mentioned to you. So things like rapid delivery, changing requirements, frequent development, daily cooperation. The individuals who work on projects should be trusted. That's a big part of it, that you can give people responsibility and authority in project development. Face-to-face conversation is the best form of communication. We talked about working software over documentation. So working software is really the principal measure of your progress. Have you made something? Sustainable development, you're able to keep a constant pace, continuous attention to technical excellence. Simplicity. When you're trying to boil things down to small pieces, you have to get very focused on what's the simplest elements that we can create at this time. So it's the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, but that is an essential portion of it. Self-organizing teams, and that's different than when you actually assign people to teams. The self-organizing teams happen somewhat organically, and people focus on the things that are important to them, and the theory is that you would get better work out of them if this is important to them. And then regular adaptation to changing circumstances. So again, things that we've already talked about. Sorry, I had all those up there. So those are all the 12 methods. So in terms of terminology, and Brian's going to go into more detail about how he practices these, but you've probably heard of this thing called a sprint, and so those are the small iterations that you would take a group through, and you would break your project into several sprints. And a sprint can be 2 to 3 weeks. It can vary, obviously, based on the project. Each within a sprint, you would have regular meetings called Scrum Meetings that allow people to communicate what they're doing, and that's part of the collaboration. But these are not lengthy, horrible meetings where people sit down and take their whole afternoon to do. These are short, stand-up meetings where everybody answers 3 questions. The questions are, what have you done? What do you still have to do in this sprint? Excuse me. And what's standing in your way? And so everybody can go around. Those shouldn't take any longer than 15 minutes with a small team of, say, 5 to 6 people. Again, very different than the horrible meetings that we're all used to. They're planned, we have to go, you sit, you hear people talk and complain and get distracted. The sprint and the product itself both have backlogs so that everybody kind of knows where you're going. It's like the plan that you have for the things that have to get done and the things that still need to get done. And another thing that really resonated with me when I was looking at Agile is that every feature needs to be described in terms of a user story. So you don't say something like, we need to make this functionality work. We need to make something that the user is going to do this with that. And that makes a big difference in terms of how empathetic I think you are with the user's needs. There are estimates that happen within each phase, each sprint, so that you know what needs to be done and how much time that it should take, and then those need to be adjusted. And there's a ranked and weighted list, which is your roadmap that drives that. And then there's usually some level of prototyping that occurs within each sprint. So it's prototype to something shippable, deliverable in the increments. And the image that you see there is a lot of little spinning circles, a lot of little iterations. So it's not one waterfall happening in a straight line. It's an iteration that starts again, and then there's several of those going on at any one time. And related, because I was at Stanford for the past year, and if you were in the design thinking talk earlier today, there are other types of methodologies that help people learn more about customer requirements, be able to spark creativity through brainstorming, to be able to prototype quickly and to do testing, and design thinking is one of those types of methodologies. I think design thinking can work really well with Agile because it can help define the requirements at the beginning of a sprint. It can actually help at the beginning of a project, but then you can implement it every time you do a sprint to make sure you're on the right track. And then it can give you that sort of paper prototype or something that you can get users working with very quickly so that you can get user requirements built in over time without having to spend a lot of money or a lot of time. So I think they work hand in hand, work very well together. And another thing that you all may have heard of, how many of you heard of the lean startup? So that's another thing. All of these are very similar in their approach. You'll see that in this case it's also a circle, so it indicates that there's not a beginning and an end, and you learn, build, and measure in the circle. And so the lean startup is another resource that I would encourage you to read that might give you some help in understanding how you can apply these techniques. And I do have to say, these techniques are not, step 1, step 2, follow this recipe. It's a mindset, and it's something that everybody has to buy in. And as the leader of a team doing this, you would want to make sure that everybody understands those goals and those values. So the topic of this talk was about using it in the classroom. So I'll get to that, and then Brian and he'll talk about how he uses it, but then we can have a discussion amongst all of you about maybe suggestions for using it in the classroom. In my thought, a semester or a quarter are well suited for 3 to 4 sprints. So even though we work with students for a short time, and sometimes that's a criticism, people will be like, we don't have enough time with the students, they're gone in 3 months, how can we get started with a live news project? Well, you can do several sprints and deliver small pieces of a larger project. You just have to be able to define what those requirements are. And it's a short time frame for learning and development, so it gets people learning and developing more quickly. It's not like you're learning all semester long and then maybe at the end of the semester you try to make something. And it helps teach collaboration. It provides regular feedback and assessment that you can do, which is very important in an educational environment to give assessment throughout the semester as opposed to just at the end. It can allow for peer feedback, and I've had some examples where I've used that. If you have a client, in some cases you can have school projects that have clients, it can allow for that kind of feedback throughout. And it allows you to embrace change and flexibility and incorporate new learning throughout the semester. So I just have a couple projects, and I'll talk about ways that Agile methodologies have been applied to it or could be applied to it. This is a project that I did a couple years ago with students. It was just a website that we wanted to look at the data associated with the fact that Texas State became a Hispanic serving institution, which means we have 25% or more of our population of our school Hispanic students. And we figured there would be a lot of data about this. And so we set this up. We gave students different beats, and they were required to each do multimedia and data visualization within their beat. So everybody was working on something slightly different. Everybody had similar ideas. Everybody was off on their own, sort of running around doing this, and then we had to pull it together in some way. So there were small chunks that people were working on, several elements of it, and there were several deliverables that we had to make sure that people executed. I do a project each year where I take students to South by Southwest because we live very close to Austin. I live in Austin, and Texas State is just 30 miles south in San Marcos. And we prepare them for going to this very large conference that could be somewhat overwhelming by having them do previews ahead of time and work on a website for it, and then do activities while they're at South by Southwest. So they have to do things like previews and coverage at the event, but I also put them into teams so they can focus on things like the development of the site, any social media to promote the site, and then new ideas for content, somebody to kind of lead the content strategy. And so in doing so, the challenge is that everybody has sort of a different assignment. And as opposed to a traditional class where everybody has the same assignment and you can kind of grade them equally based on their ability to execute the same assignment, you have to figure out a way to make that equitable, that you're working on social media, but you're developing the website. How do we make that equitable across all those teams? But it's required for this project because we have to be able to come together and have the content applicable for that. And so we use things like peer feedback to make sure that people are active members of their team. And then associated with that, a couple years ago, I did a Ushahidi installation, and we did a mobile aspect of it. We did a hackathon associated with Ushahidi, and we figured out that the only way that we would actually be able to make this platform work with us, and it was basically a way for us to check in at different places around town and have our own stories about what we were doing during South by Southwest. So you can see we had like a list of activities that we needed to accomplish during the hackathon. So instead of coming into the hackathon like, let's hack, we knew exactly what we needed to accomplish. We had done some prep ahead of time, so we had people who kind of knew what they were supposed to do, and then we had a plan for after the hackathon. And so we had different people working on different pieces of the development, and that's probably as close to like software development of Agile that we've done in an active setting. And then this semester, I am teaching a class called Coding and Data Skills for Communicators, and we're just getting started, but I'm teaching them things like JavaScript, and that's part of this ONA Challenge Fund grant that I got, where we're trying to tell stories about music in Texas. I've done music journalism in the past, but they don't really engage data very much in music journalism or data visualization. But in a city like Austin, where it matters to the economy and to the history, and there's ways to engage people with it, we're trying to figure out new ways to tell stories about music. So I've tried to set up the semester where sprints are a part of it. And so we had a coding sprint just now that they just finished, and they actually turned in their first projects while I was gone, while I was here, and they all turned them in, so I was happy to see those. We're gonna have like a data and data analysis sprint coming up, and then we're gonna have a charting, more advanced charting sprint at the end that will all lead together to some final project that we'll put together. I am approaching this in an agile manner because I don't know exactly what's gonna be the final project at this point in time. You have to be prepared for students who are uncomfortable in that environment. I have to engage them to help define some of the requirements, and again, some are responding well to this, some may have trouble with not being told exactly what to do, but this is the environment in which they're going out to work. So Agile works really well with individual and group projects. We have Scrum Meetings once a week, and I'm encouraging it to be the quick hits. We don't necessarily stand up, but answer those 3 questions. What have you done? What do you plan to do? What's standing in your way? Doing a lot of class flipping, where they have to watch videos so that we can spend a lot of time working in class and not a lot of me lecturing. And they will be able to show working demos of their projects. And we'll review progress each time. Now that this first sprint is over, we'll review that on Monday. And as I said before, the students quickly saw the value of these approaches. They kind of got it right away in a way that I was really unprepared for. And I have to say another benefit of having had this exposure to Agile is I have also used it in convincing my faculty to some innovative curriculum changes that I would like to have happen. And people had started saying things like, well, we need to do a complete overhaul of the curriculum. And I started, eyes rolling back in my head and having a fit, having a seizure of some sort when they say stuff like that, because you know what that means when you have to start over from scratch and get 20 or 30 people's buy-in. And so I introduced this idea of small incremental change, and they seem to respond to that and oh yeah, we could do that, we could do these little things and change things slowly over time instead of every 5 years doing a giant curriculum redesign. So I found just in that regard, it's been a very helpful mindset to have with my faculty.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
That incremental change, if you do it so with the incoming freshmen, it would start to fall your curriculum changes so that they would be grandfathered in, or was it something you were just doing within the classes?
The curriculum change is something separate, so that's something that we're working on, and it's not there would be a level of flexibility within that, but it's really just a mindset toward new things that we can do in our curriculum to make it more responsive to what's happening in the world, and there'll be more to come on that, let's just say. But the things that I'm doing in the classroom are the things that are going to happen over the course of this particular class that I'm teaching. So that's a separate issue, thanks. And I just have some resources here. So again, slideshare.net/Cindy Royal. You'll be able to find this presentation. So if you want more about Agile and different articles that have been written, particularly about Agile in the classroom, you can do that. So that's what I had, and I'm going to bring up the few slides that Brian has and let him talk for a while. I can drive it for you if you want. Okay.
So,
This is going to pop out.
is it going to move?
I think it will. Hold on. So you go.
Are we on screen? Nope.
Maybe it popped out.
Yeah, okay. So, like Cindy said, the Agile is it's rules for a team. The rules aren't the same for all the teams, and it is more of a philosophy about making software. The we'll start with your intuition. So a very typical scenario in the consulting world might be, or really in any software project world, is you decided up front what you were going to build. Then you spend 6 months making it, and then you finish making it, and you show it to the people for whom you were building it, and they're like, "Shit, guys, this is all wrong," right? And that's not what we asked for. And so the intuitive response to that is frequently, we needed to gather better requirements, right? We needed to know at the beginning, we didn't ask enough questions. We didn't write down in great enough detail what it was this thing needed to be, right? And that is screwy, right? That although it might tightening the screws tighter and tighter is a waste of time, right? So the idea of Agile is that it makes sort of one assumption, right? It is a rigorous process, right? You need to, and you define your own sort of rigorous process for the organization you're in, right? But it's a rigorous process that assumes that change is constant, right? So if you know over this 6-week period that you are going to change your plans of what you're going to build, what do you fix, right? If the thing you're building is always in question, what are the other screws you can tighten, right? What is the most rigorous process to get there, assuming that you don't actually know what you're going to make at the end, right? So it's a process that requires constant communication, right? You gotta be talking to each other all the time. So and it has to be really, collaboration is like a word we all throw around. It's a word we like. Yeah, I'm collaborative, right? But it has to actually be collaborative, right? It cannot be a process where I'm, in the news world, I can't just be like turning around tickets like a short order cook, right? Someone can't just say, hey man, make me an interactive map for this thing. Here's your deadline, and I'm like, sure guy, and we go make a map and we put it on the website, right? That's not how it goes. It needs to be a process where the team, the small group of people making the thing, is working side by side with the people who care about the thing, with the subject matter experts, right? So on every project we do, we always are working with a reporter and an editor on a desk or at a show at NPR that like actually knows what the hell they're talking about, right? Like our team we're not science experts or politics experts or whatever. We need a stakeholder, a person from that team to participate in the process with us, right? We are bringing them with us. It is not just, they're not outside the process, they're inside the process, and they have to agree to it. There is actually there's a wonderful consulting shop that I've learned a lot of stuff from called Menlo. They're in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and they do Agile training, which I recommend. And but they started their training practice. They started doing a training business because they realized they needed to train their clients, right? And so they would bring their clients in for like a 3-day crash course in Agile, and then they'd say, "Okay, client, if you want to give us your money, you have to agree that we're all going to work this way." And if the client said, "I don't really want to work that way," then Menlo would say, "Keep your fucking money, because this is the only way we're going to be successful." So let's talk about communication. So every hour of the day, the best you can, I like having people program and design in pairs, right? It's perhaps counterintuitive that 2 programmers at 1 keyboard are more productive than 2 programmers at 2 keyboards. There are certainly moments when our team isn't pairing, and the sort of the headphones on, nerd wizard would really rather prefer to work on their own. But they're wrong. Sometimes they're right, and I don't hire those people. But frequently they're wrong, and especially when the problem is the hardest is when you need the pairing the most. Right? Is when 2 people, you're talking to each other, you're working through your ideas, you're designing together, you're correcting each other's mistakes. Pairing is awesome, and it works for design, and it doesn't work for all writers, but I've definitely seen great writing teams who sit at the keyboard and write together as well. Every day, we have a 5-minute meeting. So not a 15-minute meeting, we do a 5-minute meeting with 15 people. I have seen a company of 40 Scrum in 5 minutes. We zip around the room. People say what they did yesterday, and they say what they're going to do today, and they say what's messing with them, right? Like what is blocking me? What's screwing with me here? You're going to see a pattern here. Every week we have a 30-minute iteration review. So every week for the people on the project, so the project team plus the stakeholders. So that would be 3 or 4 people from my team, and 1 or 2 people from the Washington desk or from the science desk or wherever. We sit down in a room, we explain what we did this week, we explain to them what we're going to do next week, and we bring up things that are fucked up, right? This is something that you don't want to do, you're afraid of doing it. You don't want to tell people like, hey, so I'm really waiting on this thing, or frequently it's because you're waiting on one of your stakeholders or one of their team members to like get you a piece of information so you can complete your stuff, right? And you have to bring it up every week. And it works. And it's a little uncomfortable. You're like, hey, we can't do this thing because we don't have this information yet, so you really got to get us this information, right? But I'd rather do it in the meeting in front of the whole team than do it sending little passive-aggressive emails, Yeah.
Do you include the editors and reporters in this?
Yeah. So this meeting, the iteration review, is actually intended to present. So the editors and reporters aren't necessarily sitting at our desk every day. So this is our moment to present them our work and for them to give us feedback on the work. Frequently what I'll do for an iteration review is I actually deploy all the code so it's running somewhere they can see it. I write up all my iteration review notes ahead of time. I send them the link to the code. I send them the notes, and hopefully they come prepared, right? But frequently they don't. We have to present, right? And we talk about, and then generally after the meeting we'll talk about specific details and things they liked or didn't like. But it's an opportunity to get feedback as frequently as possible. A lot of Agile shops, a lot of Scrum shops do 2-week sprints. In the newsroom, I can't. The longest project I've ever done at NPR was 8 weeks. was planned to be a 6-week project, and it wasn't. It ended up being an 8-week project because shit happened. But that would only mean that would have been 4 check-ins, right? Which would not have remotely been enough for the project we were working on. And then similarly, for every single project we do, we conduct a 30-minute retrospective. We talk about and retrospectives are important. It's really, really important to have rules in all these meetings, right? So this is not just like a list of things we talk about. These are the rules. We start with what we did, we talk about what we did next, and we bring up what's messed up. Same thing with a retrospective. You can imagine if you just had people come into a room, you're like, hey, what'd you think of the project, guys? Like one person who likes to talk a lot just talks, and people who don't get a chance to talk a lot don't say a thing, right? Instead, this meeting has rules, right? Okay, guys, what was awesome? And then someone says, well, I really wish we did something differently. I'm like, no. That's coming next. Tell me what was awesome, right? And we write that down. We usually do it in a Google Doc. We write it down on screen. What was awesome? What sucked about the project? And then what things do we do differently next time? So ideally we're learning from each project. And this is a meeting with both the people on the team and the stakeholders, the people we were working with. So they have to be a part of the process, right? A lot of the projects that we've done, I'd say at NPR that are not as good as they could have been were projects where we did not drive the process of how the thing happened. Somebody else had a deadline, somebody else had a way they were doing things, and we were just kind of like, hey guys, can you like help us out for a couple of weeks? And we're like, sure, we help them make it, but it doesn't work. You need to drive the process. It just makes everything better. Also, I'm an engineer, so I can say this. Screw the engineers. We frequently start our project. We're like, okay, I got some data. Let's build a database around the data, right? And then let's build a website around the database, right? And that isn't the thing, right? Engineers, they want to, engineers, they want to solve like big, interesting like engineering problems, right? And designers want to design fancy things, and writers like to, squeeze every single awesome detail into their story. And we all have to kill our darlings, right? We all have to control for our urges. And I believe the best way to succeed at these things is to lead with design, right? So and it's not like, we don't design the whole thing perfectly up front. There aren't like pixel perfect sketches at the start of a project, but we start with the interface, right? We start with what people need to use, what we need to make, and then we design the technology for it, right? And so, a lot of folks talk about the sort of practice of user-centered design, right? We have a very simple, everything we do is sort of a miniature version of Big Agile because we're working at such a high speed. And so these are 3 questions we ask with every project, and this literally might take 15 minutes. Like somebody comes to my desk and says, Brian, I got a story, it's really awesome, the reporter's gonna visit these 10 places, can we put those 10 places on a map, and then it would be really fun if you could click on each of those 10 places and read the story, right? And it's comically wrong. It is burying story under user interface. It is the opposite of what we should do, almost always. But instead of saying, no, you're dumb, right? No, that's not cool, right? What we say is, I say, okay, that's cool. This is awesome. I'm really interested in your story. Let's talk about our users for just a minute, right? Who are they? Like, who are the people who want to read this story? Who are the people that care, right? And there's sometimes in the more product-centric world, these answers are obvious. Like, we're going to build a website about schools. Who are your users? Parents. Who are your potential users? Parents, students, administrators, politicians, other journalists, right? You cut that list. Parents. Okay, what are their needs? Well, parents, some of them have kids, and so they want to know if their kid's school is doing well, and other ones don't have kids yet, and so they want to know where to live. They want to know where to move, so they go to have a good school district, right? And we work from there. So start with who the people are, talk about what they need, and then we talk about what we should build. We don't start with, I need to make a map of schools. We start with, I need to help people who have kids in school. What do they need from us? Then what we should build. Sometimes it's a map. The last thing, and this is like not remotely enough time to talk about all this stuff, but along with the constant communication comes constant prioritization, right? I feel like there are so many things that are wrong in our lives, in our newsrooms, that are rooted in failure to while, as for the last 2 years at NPR, our team has actively prioritized. We actually have a prioritization meeting like once a week at the start of each iteration. We have found that that's not even good enough. So now twice a week, on Monday afternoons and then Wednesday mornings, we go through all the things we thought we were going to do that week and prioritize them again, right? And that means, so we write down all our to-dos as issues in GitHub. You can use 3x5 cards taped to a wall. It's actually better than software usually. And what that means, so a feature is high priority. Some features are normal, some features are low. And if someone, you assign it to someone, so Danny, do this feature, right? And I shouldn't use Danny, he's like an actual teammate of mine. Bobby, do this feature. And if Bobby does the normal feature before the high feature, then Bobby's not doing his job, right? You do the highest priority thing first. It is a way for us all to work together as a team. You do the important thing, and the important thing might necessarily be the most interesting thing or the big engineering problem. It's the problem, it's the question we need to figure out so we can keep progressing on this thing. So we're always prioritizing and learning from our stakeholders, learning from what we've learned just about the subject matter, and constantly shifting our priorities and writing them down, not just talking about them as frequently as possible. And I could talk about that for like another hour. Some other stuff to read. The Lean UX book is one we've been kind of using as a playbook lately with some success. It's pretty cool. I wrote up a blog post a couple months ago about how our team works. So if you want to know actually how about our team is organized, like how the 15 people on our team, like where they sit and what their responsibilities are, we wrote that up. And I've started a new blog called How to Be Happy that is about, management stuff for software. So, all right, now we've been talking too long. What else should we talk about?
Well, I want to ask one thing. Since we're talking about how to connect this with education, one of the first articles that I read about this included you in it because you were at Medill, and I think it said that you first started using Agile while you were a student at Medill. Is that accurate, or
it's not quite true?
How did that affect your educational experience?
Well, I know I got into I was a software developer for several years before I went to journalism school, and I got into project management and sort of managing software teams because I was pissed, right? I was a programmer who I saw things being done wrong. I saw we were unhappy, we were working late nights, we were grumpy at the boss, and so I just started reading all the books and reading all the state of the art at that time of like how, better ways to manage teams, and then I ended up becoming a manager. And at Medill, the experience was actually our team. There were a couple programmers going through this program, Medill, and we ran our projects with a pretty strict Scrum, stricter Scrum than we do in the newsroom these days. But that was with Jerry McGilbert and Rich Gordon.
So what's different about doing it in the classroom than in the newsroom?
Well, I mean, the hardest. I mean, the time is hard, right? I mean, you've got how many 3 months in the classroom, right?
3-ish, yeah.
Right, and which isn't actually that many hours. I mean, how many full days is that?
I mean, you meet
a couple of weeks total.
You meet like 3 hours a week with a student.
So 3 hours a week, yeah. I mean, that's not a lot of actual time, right? So yeah, it's a week of work. Right.
For a whole semester. Not counting what they do outside of class and being creative with flipping the classroom and things like that. But yeah, you don't have them.
I mean, and one of the other things that, so at least in Medill, right? We had our magazine program. What they would do is they would actually tell the students all would have roles. So our magazine program was like a really rigorous, like how a magazine gets made every month, right? And so some students were editors of this, some students were editors of that, some students were writers, and like everyone freaking hated that somebody else was their boss, right? I don't know the right way to model that in the classroom because someone has to be the boss on a real team, right? Someone needs to be in charge of we're gonna do this, we're not gonna do that, right? Like, and so how you model who gets to decide what's a priority in the classroom? Because this is not, consensus sucks, democracy sucks, right? these aren't actual ways to make things. They're decent ways to manage a handful of roommates, you know. So.
Yeah, I mean, as the instructor, it's kind of your job to facilitate that, but not be the boss necessarily. So it is that, you know, walking around, tiptoeing around, and getting the best work out of students and having them kind of understand how the process works. Again, I'm in a very uncomfortable situation this semester because they're like, we don't know what the final project's going to be. We don't know what we're going to be measured on. We're having to develop the requirements, and I'm going to have to see how that works out.
But having rules, right? Having rules for how meetings are conducted always helps in any situation, right? So it's not just, you're not just meeting. These are the rules of how you're going to discuss this problem, right? And having rules like, this is how we decide what a feature is, right? The sort of user-centered design, having a user-centered design process, right? People are, reporters and editors can be a real pain in the ass to work with, right? And for many reasons, they're lovely, right? But if they don't necessarily get software, and they're nervous and they're worried, is this going to work? Is this going to be a thing, right? But having actually working people through this process really helps them kind of get what you're getting at, right? So all the rules probably helps.
I mean, I've found that already just very quickly. And if you can go to the mic, because they are recording this, so question people, go up to the mic, would appreciate it.
Hey, I'm Dan Pacheco of Syracuse University. Both of you, UAU here. I'm just kind of wondering, is probably more a question for Brian, but I think it could also apply to education. Let's say that you want to start being more agile, but you're working in an organization that is very much waterfall, which is a lot of legacy, or just really large organizations, right? And you have people at the top who sit in the ivory tower and then come up with the idea, and then it sort of trickles down. Do you have any thoughts about like how to start kind of changing the culture? Because that could be, you know, it's sort of a big minefield, especially for new, students graduating, going into their first jobs, for example.
I mean, I do feel like what every new team we work with is like making a small cultural change with that team, right? We are sort of slowly educating NPR as to how we like to do things, right? And so that first user-centered design exercise we do, that first iteration review is always a beast, right? Having a process and leading by example, is okay. I mean, it helps. Being rigorous helps build confidence, I guess, and being extremely transparent in your methods, right? It's something John was talking about before, like being really open about your process helps, because what you got to solve for is the fear, everyone's nervousness about the new thing, right? And so being really open about it, I think, does help solve for some of the fear.
I mean, one of the things that I just did this semester was have individual meetings with people on my faculty to kind of go through some of the ideas that I had, got faculty involved in the process of coming up with the ideas. Not all the faculty, but a subset of faculty, and then meeting with key people, almost like I was lobbying Congress, to get their needs, their concerns, address those, and then when it was time to make the final presentation, all those concerns were already in it, as opposed to, surprise, we're having a meeting today and you have to vote on this. So that transparency, consensus, making everybody feel like they're contributing.
I'm Alex. I'm an undergraduate fellow at the Northwestern Night Lab and the interactive editor of one of our campus publications. And we don't have any process at all for making like anything, for making interactive stuff or larger news apps. And part of that is just because, like you're talking about in a classroom, you have such little time, and for us to get like an hour a week, we're an extracurricular. How can we start to maybe bring some of these ideas into our newsroom and into our like section without like imposing like all these requirements on people for whom it's just an extracurricular that they don't have.
Just simply doing work in pairs. Can you get two programmers sitting at the same keyboard?
We'll see.
Okay.
We'll find out this quarter.
It's really a question of quantity. Then you have to convince them. But just so that there's a few things about pair programming we didn't talk about. Pair programming is actually a really great management hack because not only are people helping each other, helping solve problems, and talking through all this stuff, right? But it also means that they're working the whole day. Because if you're pairing, you're not checking your email, you're not reading Reddit, like you're taking bio breaks, you're getting lunch, maybe getting coffee, right? So it's a good way to fully use the amount of time you have available to you. So if you've only got an hour a week to work, you're not going to waste each other's time, right? Maybe a place to start.
And as I said, what we started with was first an understanding of this idea of small incremental change and getting people to kind of understand that philosophy that, they can be empowered to make these little tiny tweaks, and that's an expectation. And then the Scrum meetings, like the stand-up and the rules of that Scrum, like sticking to them. And so maybe just trying a weekly Scrum of some sort to get everybody knowing what everybody else is doing. And it doesn't even have to be just on the software development or the news apps, like everybody in the newsroom. What am I working on? What do I still have to finish? And what's standing in my way from doing it? Those are, perfect things for everybody to start thinking in that manner.
I'm Rebecca Blatt. I work at the Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State. And I have a program where I have students all day long, 8 to 5, and they're there 2 days a week, and they're partnered with people on the other 3 days. So a team has someone who's Monday, Wednesday, someone who's Tuesday, Thursday, and then someone who's there some combination with Friday. And so we do meetings similar to the ones that you're discussing, but the hardest part is that then they're handing off to someone who's not there at the same time. So they're not all they're not sitting side by side, and they're not all in the meeting together. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've run into, and if you have figured out, where they get stuck a lot is the communication of the handoff and knowing exactly what has been done and what hasn't been done. And when they feel like they do know that, they feel like they've spent a lot of time documenting what they did, and then that's taking time away from other things. So I'm just wondering if there's any system or software or just kind of practice that you've found to help in that kind of scenario.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. That's a hard problem. You do end up documenting a lot. You need to write down, so for instance, when someone on my team sees a bug, right? If you find a bug, your first inclination is to fix it, right? But if you found a bug, you're probably in the middle of doing something else, right? So you've suddenly put down the thing you were doing and started to do a second thing. And then oftentimes inside that bug you find a third bug, right? And then you're nested 3 levels deep and it's time for lunch, right? So the rule is you find a bug, write it down. Write it down and we're going to prioritize it later. So there's a lot of scribing. There's a lot of writing, right? Which can be frustrating, but being really granular about what you need to do, not just high level, hey, build a map, right? But being very granular about the tasks, especially with the more junior developers or students, being really specific about what needs to happen can be really helpful. I feel like with more senior developers, you can be a little more broad, but when they're solving a hard problem, you really got to bring it back in tight again. And it was one other thing I was thinking about. One practice that a lot of people consider to be required with Agile is writing really good tests, right? So you write code that tests your code, which is time-consuming. And it's even more fun, you actually write the code that tests your code before you write the code, which can be holy crap, I'm writing more code in tests than I'm writing it in code, right? And yes, you do write more tests than you write code, but you also know your software works, right? And in a collaborative environment, especially where you've got lots of people, a big team, you sit down for work, you run the test, you can see where you're at. You can see what broke, you can see how far along you are, which could be helpful. But yeah, I don't envy that. That's a hard problem.
There's all sorts of project management tools, but this past year when I was at Stanford, we still did the South by Southwest project, and I had Google Hangouts every week. We wanted to be as productive as possible on the Hangout because nobody wants to be on a Hangout for 3 hours, even if you are in your pajamas. But we tried to do the rundown, what's everybody working on, what's standing in your way, and everybody was prepared to do that. If you can't do a Hangout, maybe because students' schedules won't allow it, maybe you tape one stand-up meeting and record another and then put them somewhere where everybody can see them, and then have a way for people to comment or share on that. So I think there's probably tools that can help you at least get everybody kind of understanding what is happening.
Hi, I'm John Keegan from the Wall Street Journal. One thing that I've found is whenever we're assessing a new tool or process that comes from the software development world, we often find that it has all this extra machinery that may not be really applicable to our team. we look at it, we're like, well, that's really cool, but come on, that looks ridiculous compared to like the way we work currently. So I'm always kind of, I've been reading about Agile for years, and kind of, I think we've adopted some Agile-ish kind of behavior. When I read about the kind of style of how meetings progress and stuff like that, I think we're adopting parts of it where it makes sense. But do you have any advice for where to draw the line of like how much to go all in with this stuff? Because I don't think it's a one size fits all.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't, and I feel like some teams have a very strict, like, do you do XP? Do you do Scrum? And if you don't do this one thing, then you're not doing Scrum, right? And that works for a lot of big software companies, right? But we move at a different pace, right? Like, news just happens, and suddenly we're building software, like, in an hour, right? So I've been, I don't know where to draw the line yet, but we've just kind of been picking and choosing, and I feel like the most important parts of the stuff that I was talking about, where it's like internal transparency within the team, external transparency with your stakeholders, making sure they're integrated in the process, right? But when it comes to but we don't do the estimation game. We don't sit and estimate every single to-do. We don't always work in pairs as much as I'd like to think we do. We don't, golly. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of actual Scrum stuff that we just don't touch, right? I figure like you got to find out what works for you, right? But without the communication and without the prioritization, those are the things that seem completely essential to me.
I mean, like I said, it's a mindset, it's a philosophy, it's not a set of rules necessarily. There are rules within it, but it's really like just thinking more broadly about the philosophy.
We just don't have the chance to iterate like on a product, right? Like Lean UX is really cool, and it's a great book, you should totally read it. But that process assumes that you have a software project that will exist for the next 5 years, right? And then every couple of months you roll a new release. I roll one release and I walk. They're not the same. So let's move fast.
Yeah, sure. Joel Withrow from KPCC. So I was thinking about this topic, and it seems to me that Agile is sort of the anti-syllabus in a lot of ways. And I sat down for a second because I think you spoke earlier a little bit to how to kind of sell people on this idea of uncertainty and showing your process and the fact that you're rigorous. I think it's a great antidote to that. But I was a journalism student not long ago, and we were a pretty snotty group, and I could have imagined being like, "What? You don't have a plan for what we're going to do this semester?" And I'm sure department heads and then taking that into the working world. I have managers that do not have the time to be a part of Scrum or weekly sprint planning, that want to have a degree of control over the process and over the end product. So how do you sort of balance the right level of sort of dictated goals and requirements and those things that are just going to inevitably sort of constrain or shape the project versus trying to really sort of honor this process and be responsive to change and learning?
Right. I mean, we definitely have, like at the start of each project, we have some sketches, right? Like we're doing, I'm neck deep in elections coverage right now. And a couple weeks ago, we had we'd sort of thought about the problem. We had spent a lot of time talking about the problem. We had done some sketches. We figured out a general framework for what we think we need to make happen. And we wrote up a manifesto, wrote up a 2-page document that described what our philosophy is, so the way my teammate David Eads puts it, is that a statement of work, right? That's like what you frequently start a project with, right? It's not a statement of work, it's a statement of purpose, right? It's like, here's what we believe is important about election night and what we think we're going to try to do, and these are our goals as we stand, and we're moving towards these things. And we might have some drawings with them. We generally have an approach to a story before we begin work, right? It's not total blue sky. But then, the approach sometimes changes over time. What we don't have is like pixel perfect mock-ups at the beginning. We have like, I think this thing should have it probably should have like these 10 features, and we're going to work on them over time. And that usually works okay for people. I mean, it takes them a while to get used to the fact that there aren't perfect drawings, and they latch on the first moment they see anything that looks tangible. So it's all, yeah.
I mean, I have a syllabus, and there are general goals, like very broad goals of what I'd like the students to get out of the class. But there's also this very major level of flexibility within it that they're going to have to give me some input, and it's going to depend on how quickly they learn some of this stuff as well. And so it is a balancing act, and I really won't know until I get my evaluations how they respond to it. And sometimes you don't even know for a couple years, and then they come back and say, well, I got my job because we did this. So sometimes the evaluations are terrible, but it's like medicine, you know. And I don't know how my faculty is going to respond to it either. I mean, we're really just getting started with some of this stuff. But the things that I said were Agile-ish that I didn't really know I was doing it. I mean, we've got really good response to that, and those were pretty uncertain environments as well. It's just something as a professor you have to be cognizant of and like paying attention, like that person's struggling, give them a little bit more attention or give them some positive reinforcement, and that becomes more of what we do instead of the person who just says, like, do this. So let's go and take the one more question. We did start late, so go ahead.
Rob Hasso, Middle Tennessee State University, and I taught a class using Agile last fall, and I got to pick and choose kind of like the best of my crop from 2 departments to put it together, and we did some really good work, but I noticed the stress level and the spread too thin nature of doing that did cause some huge problems for these students. So I'm actually debating whether or not to bring some students in that are less experienced, and I was wondering if you had any advice for bringing students of different levels of ability within the same environment together.
I mean, personally, I have that all the time. I mean, people come in with different levels, and sometimes just levels of confidence are different. They may actually have the same capabilities, but some just feel really terrible about their ability to do something. And like I just said before, you have to be just very cognizant of, as an instructor, where you're paying attention to this person's struggling, this person needs a little bit more help, this person might need to be paired with somebody that has a complementary skill set, and it's just, you know, something that it's part of being Agile, just being adjusting. Every semester you're going to have a different dynamic of students that you come in, and so that's going to have to be different every time. So the best advice would be just as an instructor, pay attention. Don't be hands-off and be like, well, at the end of the semester, the grade they get is the grade they get. You know, really kind of help get the best work out of them as much as you possibly can, and knowing that, you know, you might get poor feedback on your evaluations because of it. You know, honestly, that's a concern, but it's also, you know, how the real world works, and they need to understand that they need to be part of the process and not be told every single thing they need to do.
I mean, our team is frequently composed of people with varying skill levels, right? We have several interns a year. We have more experienced folks, less experienced folks, and I think pairing helps a lot. Having 2 people, and they end up learning a lot from each other, right? I mean, two really experienced programmers pairing can be like a freaking machine to watch, man. It can be amazing. But also watching, you know, the opportunity for a more senior programmer to teach a more junior programmer is good for both parties, right? Like teaching makes you smarter, right? And so I love that we frequently put some of our most senior people with some of our most junior people because they're teaching, right? Maybe goals are a little different in the classroom, but you know, and the other thing, you know, then we didn't talk about much, but the sort of one of the lean UX philosophies is that the design process is something that you do as a group. So the designer is a facilitator. The designer's not making perfect drawings. So a designer is facilitating a process for designing software that the whole team participates in, right? So sort of collaborative design is another really great way to sort of bring in people with different skill levels and different skills, right? But still have them all be part of the process.
So do you have just a comment? Because we don't have time for more questions.
Oh, I did have one question. I'll talk.
Okay. Yeah, we can talk. Anybody who has anything else they want to talk about?
It's the failure question, but.
We'd be happy to stick around, but thank you all very much, and keep in touch with me.
Thanks for sticking around.
Yeah, thanks for sticking around with us this afternoon. Appreciate it.
Screw Cookie Monster.